40 years behind the microphone, millions of viewers. The biggest comeback in golf history unfolding live, and the man paid to describe it chose silence. 2 minutes and 42 seconds of it. No words, no clever phrase. Just the sound of a crowd losing its mind while the broadcaster stayed perfectly, deliberately quiet. That decision didn't come from instinct alone. It came from a story most people never knew was happening. Jim Nantz was not supposed to be a broadcaster. He was supposed to take over his father's business. Growing up in Houston, Nantz was raised by a man who planned everything. His father, Jim Nantz Jr., sold wholesale office furniture and ran his life like a carefully drafted blueprint. The plan was simple. His son would one day step in, take the reins, and carry the family name forward. For years, that was the assumption both of them lived with. Then, at 11 years old, the younger Jim sat his father down and told him something different. He wanted to work for CBS. He wanted to broadcast the Masters tournament. Most fathers would have smiled politely and changed the subject. His father did not. Instead, he looked at his son and said, "You've got to figure out every possible angle. Work for it. Dream big. If it's something you wanted badly enough, work for it. Believe in it, you can make it happen." That response shaped everything that followed. Not because it was encouraging, plenty of parents say encouraging things, but because his father meant it, treated it like a real plan, and never once stopped believing in it. There is something worth understanding here. Jim Nantz did not stumble into one of the greatest broadcasting careers in American sports history. He aimed at it deliberately, from childhood, with a father standing behind the plan. Everything he became started with that conversation. What neither of them knew was that the plan would eventually cost more than either could have imagined. At the University of Houston, Jim Nantz did two things. He studied broadcasting, and he played on the golf team. The golf team part did not last long, not because he lacked dedication, but because of who he was living with. His roommates at Taub Hall were Fred Couples and Blaine McAllister, two of the most gifted young golfers in the country. Watching them practice, watching them compete, Nantz arrived at a quiet and honest conclusion. He could talk about golf far better than he could ever play it. He put his clubs away and never looked back. But something happened in that dormitory that nobody outside of it knew about for years. Nantz and Couples used to rehearse a moment they both dreamed of reaching. Nantz would sit across from Couples and play the role of the interviewer. Couples would play the role of the Masters champion. They ran through it like actors preparing for a scene. At one point, Couples told Nantz he hoped to win the Masters one day. Nantz told him, "I don't see why that can't happen. You've got a game suited for that course." Nantz later reflected on those Houston years by saying, "My goal was to one day broadcast the Masters, the NFL, and the Super Bowl, and all those dreams have come true." They wouldn't have if I wasn't at the University of Houston. Neither of them could have known, sitting in that dormitory room in Texas, that the rehearsal would one day become real, that the moment they had practiced would actually arrive, and that when it did, neither of them would be ready for how it would feel. In August of 1985, CBS called Jim Nantz out of the blue and invited him to audition. He passed. The network hired him on the spot. One colleague who witnessed it said simply, "He just blew everybody away with his audition." By the following spring, Nantz was at Augusta National for the first time in his life. He had not been sent there to broadcast. The legendary CBS golf producer Frank Cherkinian had summoned the young announcer to shoot promotional clips that would air during the network's basketball coverage. Simple assignment. Straightforward plan. Except the crew assigned to film the promos had missed their connecting flight and were stuck in Atlanta. Cherkinian handed Nantz a set of clubs and told him to go play while they waited. So Jim Nantz, 26 years old, walked Augusta National alone for the first time. No cameras, no crowd, just the course. He later described it by saying, "Seeing it for the first time, I wanted to keep playing." Eventually, Cherkinian pulled him back to work. Standing in front of the camera, with nothing scripted and no one coaching him, Nantz searched for the right words to describe what he had just experienced. What came out was this: a tradition unlike any other. He said it once, for a promo that would air between basketball games. Augusta National liked it enough to eventually trademark the phrase. The man who coined it had been at the course for less than a day. That same spring, Nantz stayed at Augusta to call his very first Masters broadcast. CBS placed him in the tower behind the 16th hole. He was 26 years old, less than a year into his network career, and surrounded by broadcasters who had been doing this for decades. He later admitted what he was thinking at the time. What in the world was CBS thinking putting me in the 16th tower? I was just a kid. What nobody knew going into that final Sunday was that they were about to witness one of the most dramatic days in golf history. Jack Nicklaus was 46 years old, considered finished by nearly everyone who covered the sport. He began the final round 4 strokes behind the lead, surrounded by a leaderboard packed with future Hall of Famers, Greg Norman, Seve, Tom Watson, Nick Price among them. Nobody was talking about Nicklaus. Then he started moving. When Nicklaus stepped to the 16th tee, Nantz set the moment up perfectly, then turned to analyst Tom Weiskopf and asked what must be going through Jack's mind. Weiskopf delivered a remarkable answer right up to the moment of impact. Nicklaus launched his 5-iron, the ball caught the slope, and settled 3 feet from the flag. The crowd erupted. Nicklaus made the birdie, and Nantz, purely on instinct, said the words that would echo for decades. There's no doubt about it, the bear has come out of hibernation. He walked off that tower afterwards, convinced he had made a terrible mistake. He thought he had borrowed the line from someone else on the broadcast without realizing it. He described walking back to the CBS compound, in his own words, dejectedly. Then Ken Venturi pulled up in a cart, grinning. You may be lucky enough to one day broadcast 50 Masters tournaments, Venturi told him, but you will never see a day greater than this around Augusta National. The line was original, the call was his, and Frank Jerkinian made sure Nantz knew he was coming back the following year. For years, Jim Nantz and his father had a plan. When the broadcasting career took off, the original plan, the one about taking over the family business, was quietly replaced by a better one. The two of them would travel together. Super Bowls, Masters Weeks, Final Fours. The son would bring the father into the world he had built. In the spring of 1995, that plan ended. His father was visiting him in Fort Worth during a PGA Tour event when he suffered a stroke. He recovered gradually, regaining some speech and movement. But what followed the stroke was something far harder to recover from. Doctors in Houston diagnosed him with Alzheimer's disease. Slowly, steadily, the man who had told his 11-year-old son to dream big began losing his memories, including the memory of his son. Nantz needed a way to reach him, something simple enough to cut through the fog. He visited his father and made him a quiet promise. When I come on the air, he said, I'm going to look into that lens and say, hello, friends. And when you hear that, you'll know I'm thinking of you. In 2002, those words went out over national television for the first time. Millions of viewers heard a warm, familiar greeting and thought nothing more of it. None of them knew they were witnessing a son speak privately to his father in the only language that still had a chance of reaching him. Nantz said it before every broadcast from that point forward. He never stopped. Go back to 1992 for a moment. Fred Couples had just won the Masters. He walked into Butler Cabin to receive the green jacket, and sitting across from him with a microphone was his old dormitory roommate from Houston. The man who had played the interviewer in their rehearsals a decade earlier. The man who had told him in a college dorm room that he had the game to win this tournament. One reporter described what followed as a script right out of Hollywood. Couples buried his face in Nantz's shoulder and wept. There was no way to fully explain that moment to the television audience watching at home. They saw two men overwhelmed by emotion. What they did not see was 10 years of shared dreaming, a dormitory room in Texas, two young men rehearsing a scene they were not sure would ever become real. Nantz later placed that Masters in a category entirely separate from every other he had witnessed. Not Tiger in 1997. Not the comeback in 2019. When asked about his most personal Masters memory, his answer was always the same. Nothing can touch my heart more than that. Two roommates, one impossible dream. Both of them standing in Butler Cabin on a Sunday afternoon in April, proving that the most carefully rehearsed moments in life are sometimes the ones that leave you completely speechless. 5 years after Fred Couples, a 21-year-old named Tiger Woods arrived at Augusta and did something nobody had ever done before. He won the Masters by 12 strokes, the most dominant performance in the tournament's history. When the moment arrived, Nantz delivered 4 words that have never left the sport: a win for the ages. It was the kind of call that sounds inevitable in hindsight, but requires genuine instinct in the moment. No hesitation, no reaching for something clever. Just 4 words that captured exactly what the world had just witnessed. What made it significant was not just the call itself, but what Nantz understood watching Tiger that day. He was not simply watching a golfer win a tournament. He was watching the beginning of something that would define the next 2 decades of the sport. A story that was only just opening. Nantz would follow that story through everything that came after. The dominance, the injuries, the years of silence, the slow, painful rebuilding of a career most people had quietly written off. He watched all of it. He waited. And when the final chapter of that story began writing itself on an April Sunday 22 years later, Jim Nantz was exactly where he needed to be. In April of 2019, Tiger Woods won a major championship for the first time in 11 years. For anyone who had followed the sport through the previous decade, the injuries, the surgeries, the public humiliations, the years when golf without Tiger felt like a different sport entirely, it was almost impossible to process in real time. Nantz was not in the broadcast tower that day. He was already inside Butler Cabin, preparing for the green jacket ceremony, watching the final moments on a monitor. When Tiger's ball dropped into the hole and the crowd erupted, Nantz spoke 5 words into the microphone. The return to glory. Then he said nothing. For 2 minutes and 42 seconds, he held complete silence while the world watched Tiger embrace his caddy, walk through the crowd, and find his son Charlie waiting for him outside the ropes. The roar of the patrons filled every second of it. Before the final stroke had even been played, Nantz had already told his producer Lance Barrow through his earpiece that he would not be speaking. He had also sent a message to analyst Nick Faldo: stay quiet. He later explained the decision without any hesitation. There wasn't a chance in the world that I was going to say anything. I never would have jumped on a moment that was that big. There was nothing you could do to add to it. You could only ruin it. 40 years behind the microphone had taught him one thing above everything else: never step on a big moment. In 2023, Jim Nantz called his final college basketball tournament for CBS. He chose Houston as the place to say goodbye, the city where the dream had started, the university where he and Fred Couples had rehearsed moments they were not sure would ever come true. After the final buzzer, analyst Grant Hill looked at him on air and said simply, "He's the GOAT." Bill Raftery, his longtime broadcast partner, added, "You told it better than most." Let me tell you, Nantz spoke his farewell quietly. One thing I learned through all of this is, everybody has a dream, and everybody has a story to tell. Just try to find that story. Be kind. Then he added 4 more words. Thank you for being my friend. He was not playing off his famous greeting. He meant it directly, completely, to everyone listening. Today, Nantz still calls NFL games